The call came through on a Tuesday morning, which I always thought was a strange day for the world to change. Not a Monday, not a Friday, not even a dramatic Wednesday, just Tuesday. I was standing in my kitchen in Cairns eating cold toast over the sink when my phone buzzed with a message from a government address I had never seen before. It said 3 things. First, that I had been selected. Second, that I had 48 hours to decide. Third, that if I told anyone before the decision window closed, the offer would be withdrawn immediately. My name is Jesse Calloway. I am 20 years old. I study marine biology at James Cook University, and up until that Tuesday, I had never done anything more remarkable than survive a jellyfish sting on the esplanade without crying in public. That last part matters more than it sounds, because a blue bottle got me right on the neck, and it genuinely felt like being stabbed with a hot fork. Most people cry. I did not. I went home, put some ice on it, and watched cricket. I mention this not to brag. I mention it because I think it is relevant to why they chose me. The full briefing came through 2 hours after the first message, delivered via an encrypted app that deleted itself after I read it. The Galactic Academic Exchange Program, which had apparently existed in secret for 11 years, had selected Earth's first student representative to travel aboard an alien research vessel for a period of 6 weeks. The species hosting the program were called the Veil Collective. The ship was called the Perpendicular Thought. The selection process had involved scanning biosignals from approximately 400 million humans across every continent and running them through a psychological assessment framework the Veil had developed over centuries of interstellar diplomacy. Out of 400 million people, they picked me. The assessment rubric was included in the briefing document, which I found both flattering and slightly annoying. I scored high on adaptability, low on hierarchical anxiety, high on what they called threshold tolerance, which basically meant I could sit in uncomfortable situations for a long time without breaking. I also scored an 8 out of 10 for something labeled docility potential, which felt less like a compliment and more like something you would write about a Labrador. But I signed the consent form anyway because, honestly, what else was I going to do? My mom thought I was going on a research trip to the Coral Sea. The shuttle that picked me up was disguised as a small regional charter plane. 2 men in plain clothes met me at a private airfield outside the city and drove me to what looked like a standard government facility near the coast. Inside, behind 3 layers of security that would have been impressive if I had not just woken up from a nap in the car, a woman named Dr. Ella Marsh shook my hand and handed me a folder. Elaine was the kind of person who spoke quickly and expected you to keep up. She had short gray hair and the focused eyes of someone who had not had a full night's sleep in several years. She told me the Veil had specifically requested a human from a coastal tropical region on the basis that the climate conditions correlated with lower baseline cortisol responses to environmental stress. In other words, people who grew up near things that could kill them tended to be calmer in general. North Queensland, Elaine explained, had produced some of the most statistically relaxed humans on the planet, despite or possibly because of the fact that the local wildlife included cassowaries, saltwater crocodiles, box jellyfish, and Approximately 900 species of spider. I said that sounded about right. She gave me a list of things I was allowed to bring. The list was short. She gave me a second list of things I was not allowed to bring. That list was long and included firearms, religious materials that might be interpreted as weaponry, anything that produced strong odors, and several categories of food that were described only as biologically provocative. I packed my bag carefully, following the first list. Then I packed a small jar of Vegemite at the bottom of my bag underneath a spare pair of shorts because some things are non-negotiable. The boarding process itself was unremarkable in the way that only very strange things can be unremarkable. The shuttle lifted vertically from a sealed hangar, climbed through the cloud layer, and then continued climbing for a long time. I watched cairns get small beneath me and then disappear into blue. I watched the blue get dark. I watched the dark get full of stars. I had my noise canceling headphones on and was listening to a playlist I had made for long trips, which started with something calm and got progressively more upbeat. After the 40-minute mark, the perpendicular thought became visible. About 20 minutes after we left the atmosphere, it was not what I expected, though I am not entirely sure what I had expected. It was not a smooth silver disc or a dramatic wedge shape like something out of a film. It was long and slightly irregular, like a piece of coral that had grown several directions at once without committing to any of them. It had a dull, dark surface that caught light in patches and absorbed it. Everywhere else, it looked less like a vehicle and more like something that had been alive once and was now being used as one. I thought it was brilliant. The docking procedure was automated and took about 12 minutes. I sat in my seat and watched the hangar doors open around us, which felt like being swallowed by something that was trying very hard to be polite about it. Lights ran along the interior in a color I could not name, somewhere between green and the feeling you get just before it rains. The doors of the shuttle opened. I picked up my bag, put on my things, and walked out. The first alien I saw was Curator 9. It stood approximately 2 m tall, had a posture like a question mark that had decided to become confident, and moved with a sort of careful precision that reminded me of someone carrying a full cup of tea across a room. Its face, if you could call it that, had nose and 2 sets of eyes arranged in a gentle arc across a smooth, dark surface. It wore something that was technically clothing, the way a river is technically water. It spoke first. The translation came through a small device clipped behind my ear that Elaine had fitted before departure, and the words arrived in clear, precise English with no lag at all. Jess Calloway, welcome aboard the Perpendicular Thought. I am Curator 9, assigned as your orientation coordinator. You will follow me, I said. Good day, how are you going? Curator 9 paused for exactly 2 seconds. I am functional, it said, which I thought was a reasonable answer. I followed it down a corridor that curved upward slightly, which should have been disorienting but was not. The air smelled clean in a way that had no specific scent, like the idea of fresh air rather than the thing itself. There were other crew members in the corridor, and they all stopped and looked at me as I walked past, not hostile, not welcoming, just the focused attention of beings encountering something they had studied at length but never seen in person. I gave a couple of them a nod, One of them made a sound I could not interpret. Another stepped back half a pace. Curator 9 showed me to my quarters, which were small but not uncomfortable. There was a surface that served as a bed, a narrow window that showed the stars at a slightly wrong angle, and a shelf with nothing on it. I put my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed. The material shifted slightly under my weight like firm foam. "Is there coffee?" I asked. "There is no coffee aboard the Perpendicular Thought," Curator 9 said. "The substance is not available in this vessel's provisions." I looked at the empty shelf. I looked at the narrow window. I looked at the stars, which were very far from cairns. "Right," I said. "Rough start." Curator 9 scheduled my first formal introduction for the following morning. In the meantime, I was asked to review a briefing document on Vale social customs, which I read carefully for about 40 minutes before my eyes started going. The document was thorough. It covered greetings which were formalized and specific to rank. It covered proximity rules because personal space meant something different here, and not respecting it was considered aggressive. It covered eye contact, vocal tone, and the use of casual speech, which was listed as inadvisable except in clearly designated informal contexts. I read all of it. In the morning, Curator 9 walked me to a wide circular room where a Vale scientist stood, waiting with the particular stillness of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times. She was introduced as High Scholar Vosta, senior xenobiologist and the lead researcher on the human integration study. She had 4 arms, 2 of which were folded. Her eyes were deep amber and completely still. I said, "Gay, how you going?" There was a silence, not the silence of people thinking, the silence of people experiencing something they were not prepared for. The translation device rendered my greeting in Vale, and whatever it produced caused Vasetta to go very still in a different way than before. Her top 2 arms moved slightly apart, which I later learned was a threat display posture. 2 other scientists in the room each took a careful backward. Curator 9 spoke quickly in Vale and then turned to me. "The phrase you used is being interpreted as a territorial challenge. Please stand still and make no further vocal sounds." For a moment I stood still. I made no further vocal sounds. After about 30 seconds, Vasetta's arms lowered. The 2 scientists returned to their original positions. Curator 9 said something else in Vale, and Vasetta looked at me for a long time with those amber eyes before giving a single slow nod. "She acknowledges your presence," Curator 9 said. I nodded back. "Cheers," I said. Curator 9 translated this as, "I am grateful for your awareness of my existence," which was perhaps the most formal thing I had ever said. I decided to let it stand. That afternoon I unpacked the rest of my bag. The Vegemite came out last. I twisted the lid off to check it had survived the journey, and the smell immediately filled the small cabin in a way that smells do when you are in an enclosed space with recycled air. Within 90 seconds, an alert chimed in the corridor, and 3 figures in what I can only describe as hazard-adjacent clothing appeared at my door with scanning devices. They scanned the jar. They scanned me. They scanned the jar. Again. One of them made a sound that Curator 9, appearing at the back of the group, translated as source of biological anomaly confirmed and contained. I put the lid back on. Curator 9 looked at the jar for a moment. What is that substance? Vegemite. I said, it is a yeast extract spread. It is delicious on toast. There is no toast. Aboard the perpendicular thought, I am aware, I said. The three scientists left. Curator 9 remained, looking at the jar with what I had come to understand was concentrated attention. I offered it the open lid to smell. It did not smell. It did, however, spend 11 minutes documenting the jar on a small recording device, which I thought was a very thorough response to a breakfast condiment. That night I lay on the surface that served as a bed and stared at the ceiling, which glowed faintly with a light that was designed to simulate rest conditions. Outside my narrow window, the stars were still there at their slightly wrong angle. I thought about the cassowary that lived in the scrub at the back of my mom's property. That bird had 6 centimeters of killing claw and the temperament of someone who had just been told their order was wrong at a drive-through. I had grown up walking past it every morning. It had looked at me the same way Visita had that first morning, which was the look of a creature deciding whether I was worth the effort. I had survived the cassowary. I was fairly confident I would survive this. I pulled my blanket up, closed my eyes, and went to sleep. From the corridor outside my door came the faint, careful sounds of beings who found my ability to sleep extremely concerning and were quietly debating amongst themselves what it meant. I did not hear them. I was already asleep on my third day aboard the perpendicular thought. I accidentally walked into a restricted cargo bay, and the day only got stranger. From there, the bay was at the end of a corridor I had taken by mistake because the ship's internal map, which Curator 9 had loaded onto a small handheld device for me, used a spatial orientation system that assumed you thought in 3 dimensions simultaneously and with great precision. I did not. I thought in the way most people think, which is forward and vaguely leftward when uncertain. The door to the cargo bay was not sealed. It was partially open, held that way by thin support beam that had been wedged underneath it, which anyone who grew up in a house where nothing was ever properly fixed would recognize as a temporary solution that had been temporary for quite a long time. I pushed the door gently with one finger. It swung inward. I went in. The cargo bay was large and dim, lit from above by strips of the same unnameable color that ran through the rest of the ship. Space smelled different from the rest of the vessel, denser and warmer, like something alive was in there and had been for a while. Tall containers lined 3 of the 4 walls, sealed and stacked, and in the center of the room, in a low open enclosure made of a dark mesh-like material, something was sleeping. It was about the size of a large dog, but built differently, lower to the ground, with a broader frame and a head that sat forward on its body like it was always leaning into whatever it was looking at. Its skin, or whatever covered it, was a deep textured charcoal, and it had 4 legs and a tail that curled loosely around its sleeping body. Even at rest it had density to it, a sense of compressed strength, the way a coiled rope looks like it wants to be useful. I squatted down about 2 m away and looked at it. It opened its. They were copper-colored, very wide, and they fixed on me with the total attention of something that had been designed by evolution to notice things that moved. For a moment nothing happened, then it inhaled a slow, deliberate draw of air, and its head Lifted. I said, "Oh, look at you." I said it the way you say it when you find a possum in a tree or a lizard on a hot fence post, quiet and warm and not threatening in any way, because there was no threat in me. I was genuinely charmed. It was a very impressive creature, and it was looking at me with an intensity that I found interesting, rather than alarming, because interesting and alarming are different things, and I have always thought people mix them up. The creature held perfectly still. I slowly extended one hand, palm upward, the way you do when you want an animal to make its own choice about you. I did not move toward it. I just made myself available. For about 15 seconds, nothing happened. Then the creature rose from its sleeping position, walked the 2 meters between us in 4 careful steps, and pressed its head against my open palm. I scratched it behind the raised plates on the side of its skull that I had decided were probably where ears should be. It made a sound low in its chest, not quite a rumble and not quite a purr, something in between. I kept scratching. I did not notice the security team. They were visible through a small reinforced window on the far wall of the cargo bay, 6 of them, and I found out later they had been standing there for approximately 3 minutes without moving. One of them had called Curator 9. Another had activated a recording device. A third had, according to the incident report I was shown week later, quietly begun updating a personal note in which he kept track of things he had witnessed that he could not explain. Curator 9 appeared at my shoulder about 40 seconds after the creature and I reached our agreement. I heard it come in, but I did not turn around because the creature had decided to sit down next to my leg and lean against it, and I did not want to disrupt that. J. Calloway, Curator 9 said in the flat, precise way it always said my full name when it had concerns. Please describe your current understanding of the animal beside you. Big fella, I said. Very friendly once you show it your hand. That animal is a keg guard beast. Curator 9 said it is the only one of its kind currently aboard this vessel. It serves as a deterrent for restricted areas. It has not permitted physical contact from any crew member in the 11 months it has been aboard. Its handler has not been able to approach within 3 m without it displaying threat behavior. I looked down at the KE. The KTH looked up at me with its copper eyes. I scratched it again. It leaned harder against my leg. It seems fine, I said. There was a pause. Curator 9 said slowly, it does appear to be fine. The incident made it into a formal report within the hour. I know this because High Scholar Vassetta mentioned it to me the following morning at breakfast, which was one of the 3 designated social interaction periods the ship ran each day and which I attended because the food, while strange, was at least consistent. Visita sat across from me and placed a recording device on the table between us. With the practice calm of someone conducting an interview they had prepared for, she began asking me questions about my childhood, not in a personal way, in the way a scientist asks questions, which is systematically and with the intent of building a picture. She wanted to know where I had grown up. She wanted to know what the environment was like. She wanted to know specifically what kinds of animals I had encountered on a regular basis and how I had responded to them as a child. I told her about the cassowary at my mom's place. I told her about the time I found a red-bellied black snake in the bathtub when I was 9 and had to call my neighbor Kevin to come and move it while I stood on the toilet lid. I told her about the year I was 12 and my dad took me diving on the outer reef, and I came face to face with a tiger shark at about 4 m depth. I told her the shark had been more startled than I was, which was true, and that I had watched it turn and disappear into the blue and thought that was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, which was also true. Bosetta listened to all of this without moving. When I finished, she looked at the recording device and then back at me. She had that amberied stillness again. Then she said through the translation device, "You observed these animals without attempting to leave the situation." "Well," I said, "with the snake I did get on the toilet lid, but you did not leave the bathroom. The snake was between me and the door and the shark encounter. You described it as beautiful." "It was," I said. "It was a big shark. It moved really well." Vasetta made a note. "I ate something that looked like Pable's segment of something larger and tasted faintly of the sea, which I appreciated." We sat in what I thought was a comfortable silence, and what she was later processing I learned as deeply significant data. That afternoon, I was invited to attend one of her lectures, not as a subject, as an audience member, though I suspect the distinction was blurred. The lecture was being given to a group of junior researchers on the topic of human psychological architecture, and it was in a strange way about me without being about me. Vazetta stood at the front of the room and spoke for a long time in Vale, and Curator 9 sat beside me and gave me a running translation in a low voice. The core of the lecture was about limits. Every species the Veal had ever studied, Visito explained, had a measurable psychological load capacity, a point at which stress, fear, environmental demand, and social complexity combined to produce response failure. Some species reached that point quickly, others, more resilient, could hold it longer. Entire framework of veiled diplomacy and biology was built around this understanding. You knew how much a species could carry. You knew where the edge was. Humans, she said, did not appear to have this edge in any location they had yet found. It was not that humans were fearless. They showed clear fear responses. It was not that humans were unaffected by stress. Their biology reacted like any other species. It was that they appeared to simply continue. Regardless, they absorbed the load, added it to whatever they were already carrying, and kept going without recalibrating, like a structure that should have collapsed under its own weight but had instead found some other way to distribute force that no one had mapped yet. She used the phrase biologically unreasonable persistence. I thought that was an interesting way to put it. After the lecture, one of the junior researchers, a young Vale called Fenoru, who had been assigned to observe me for 3 hours each day and who had started bringing a snack to these sessions because I tended to wander around at meal times and Fenoru did not want to miss anything, asked me a question through Curator 9. The question was, when you feel afraid, what do you do? I thought about it honestly. Usually I wait a bit, I said, then I deal with whatever it is. Fenoru made a note with a kind of focused agitation that I had come to recognize as the Veil equivalent of being surprised, and if there is nothing you can do, then I wait a bit longer, I said. Something usually shifts. Fenoru looked at Curator 9. Curator 9 looked at me. I looked at both of them and wondered if there was any of that pale sea-tasting food left from lunch. The following day I had what Curator 9 cautiously described as an unscheduled interaction with the vessel's nutritional provisions. What happened was this: I was in the common area between the two research bays, which had a narrow shelf along one wall, with sealed containers of crew provisions. The containers were clearly labeled in Vale, which I could not read, and they were clearly intended for Vale crew, which I understood, but I had been awake since early and had not eaten, and one of the containers was already open and smelled like something that might be food. I tried one. It was dense and slightly bitter and had a texture like firm bread soaked in something savory. It was strange, but it was food. I ate two more, which felt like a reasonable amount. Curator 9 found me 20 minutes later and went very still in the way. That meant something significant had happened. You ate 3 containers of emergency biological rations, it said. They were in the cupboard. I said they. One was already open. The containers are labeled emergency use only. They are formulated for Vale biology during crisis situations. They contain compounds that are listed as survivable in small quantities for most species encountered by the collective, but which are not intended for regular consumption by non-Vale organisms. I looked at the empty containers. I looked at Curator 9. I felt fine. Survivable seems like a good sign, I said. Curator 9 took the containers away and spent an hour running health scans on me, all of which came back unremarkable. My blood chemistry, it said, had responded to the foreign compounds by simply processing them the way a drain deals with water, without apparent distress or modification. It filed a report. Report eventually reached Vasetta, who updated her notes and added 3 new entries to her framework under the heading of physical threshold anomalies. She told me later, when we had known each other long enough, that she had started adding personal observations to our sessions, that the ration incident had been the moment she stopped thinking of me as a curiosity and started thinking of me as a problem she genuinely wanted to understand. I told her I was glad she was enjoying the research. She told me that enjoyment was not a concept she applied to her work. Then she paused and added with the careful precision of someone acknowledging something they had not expected to acknowledge, though I admit the data from the study is generating something I can only describe as enthusiasm. I said that was very nice. She closed her notes and made a small sound I was not able to name. Curator 9, standing in the doorway, translated it for me later as the Vale equivalent of a reluctant smile. That was the same evening I first became aware that the crew had started treating me differently. It began with the junior researchers. Fenoru had been telling others about the shark story, and the Keth incident had been circulating in some form since day 3, but the shift I noticed on day 6 was subtler. When I walked into room, people did not move away. They oriented toward me, not in a crowding way, in the way a room full of people orients toward the door when someone important walks through it, except that I was not important in any way I was aware of. I mentioned this to Curator 9 during our daily orientation check. Curator 9 was quiet for a moment. You are exhibiting a behavioral pattern that the crew is interpreting as dominant. Signaling, it said. I am not signaling anything, I said. Yes, said Curator 9. That is the signal. I asked what that meant. It explained carefully that Vale's social structure was hierarchical, in a way that was biological as much as cultural. Status was maintained through visible behaviors, controlled movement, restrained response to unexpected situations, deliberate allocation of attention. High-status individuals moved with purpose and showed no evidence of being affected by their environment. Low-status individuals adjusted themselves constantly to accommodate the space around them. I walked around the ship without adjusting to anything, it said, because I was not tracking the hierarchy. And because I was not tracking the hierarchy, I was not performing any of the adjustment behaviors that signaled a lower position. I had also apparently been making sustained and comfortable eye contact with high-ranking crew members, which in Vale culture was something only equals or superiors did. So they think I am senior to them, I said. Several of them are not certain what rank you are. Curator 9 said that uncertainty is itself being interpreted as a signal. I thought about this. I asked if there was anything I should do about it. Curator 9 looked at me for a moment. I do not believe there is anything you are able to do about it, it said. The behaviors in question are from your perspective, simply how you exist. I had not thought about it that way before. I went back to my quarters that night and sat by the narrow window. The stars were there at their wrong angle, very still and very far away. I thought about what Curator 9 had said. I thought about the cassowary and the snake and the shark. I thought about growing up in a place where the beautiful things were also the dangerous ones, and how that had never seemed like a contradiction to me, only like an interesting feature of the world. I wondered if that was what Vasetta was trying to understand, not what made me brave, because I did not think I was particularly brave, but what made me so entirely unbothered by the fact that the world was full of things that could, if they wanted to, cause me a great deal of difficulty. The answer, I thought, was probably nothing complicated. I had just never seen the point in letting possibilities ruin the present moment. The shark was in the water, the snake was in the bath, the aliens were on the ship. Each of those things was what it was, and being afraid of it in advance did not change what it was. It only changed what I did with the time I had before I had to deal with it. Fenoru knocked on my door at that point and asked if I was available for the 3-hour observation session. I had forgotten it was that evening. I said, "Sure, come in," and moved over on the narrow window ledge so there was room. Fenoru came in, sat down, got out its snack, and opened its note-taking device. We sat by the window together and looked at the stars. After a while, Fenoru asked through the translation device, "Do you find this frightening, being this far from your world?" I thought about it. "No," I said. Fenoru wrote that down. It wrote it down with the careful attention of someone who believed they were recording something important. I watched it write, and I thought that was a nice thing to be taken seriously by something that had come from so far away, even if neither of us was entirely sure what was being taken seriously. Outside, the stars held their positions. The ship moved through them steadily, carrying us both somewhere new. Nobody told me there was a diplomatic delegation arriving on day 9. Curator 9 told me on day 10, after the delegation had already been aboard for 12 hours and the negotiations were already in crisis, which is the sort of sequence of events that should have been preventable but apparently required me to be involved first. The Darwin Compact were the Vale's longest and most complicated diplomatic partners. That was how Vasetta described them when she sat down next to me at breakfast on day 9 and explained with a tight expression of someone trying to convey severity without causing alarm that a Heil delegation had docked at the secondary bay during the night. She explained that these negotiations had been running in various forms for 60 years. She explained that the current session was particularly sensitive because it involved resource agreements that would affect approximately 40 star systems and several hundred million lives. She told me very clearly that I was to remain in my quarters or in the research section until the delegation had departed in approximately 3 days. I nodded and said I understood. I understood completely. I had no intention of going anywhere near the negotiations. I had no interest in diplomatic summits, no understanding of interstellar resource law, and no relevant skills to offer. I was a marine biology student from Cairns. I planned to stay in my lane. The problem was that the formal reception was held in the gathering hall, which was adjacent to the corridor that led from the research section to the provisions area, and I became extremely hungry at exactly the time it began. I had been in the research section for 6 hours helping Vasetta catalog biological samples from a planet I could not pronounce, which involved a lot of precise tagging work. That was not difficult, but was very absorbing. And when I finally surfaced and checked the time, I realized I had missed both the midday meal and the late afternoon provisions window. The research section had nothing edible in it. The nearest food was in the common area past the gathering hall. The gathering hall doors were open. I stopped at the entrance and looked in. The room was large and formal, arranged with long, low tables and seating that was designed for Vale physiology, which meant it was technically usable by humans but required some creative positioning. The lighting was ceremonial, warmer than the rest of the ship, casting everything of color that reminded me of late afternoon on the water. There were about 30 beings in the room. The Vale delegation occupied one side of the central table. On the other side sat the Darwin Compact, who were longer and thinner than the Vale, with pale gray skin and eyes set very wide apart that gave them an expression of perpetual careful observation. Everyone was in formal clothing. Everyone had the rigid posture of people who had been in a tense room for too long and were performing composure for an audience. The only empty seat was at the far end of the table. I should have turned around. I want to be clear about that. Looking back, turning around was the correct and obvious choice, but the seat was there and I was hungry, and on some level my brain interpreted the open door and the empty seat as an invitation, the way a brain trained North Queensland interprets an open gate, as a suggestion rather than a prohibition. I went in, sat down, and put my bag on my lap. The nearest Vale crew member looked at me with wide eyes. I gave them a small nod. They looked back at the table. Beside me was one of the Dacian delegates, an elderly being whose gray skin had taken on a slightly silver quality around the face and hands. He was sitting with the rigid formality of someone who had been sitting rigidly for decades and had developed a way of making it look natural. He glanced at me sideways. I pulled out the Tim Tams. I had 2 packets left. I had been rationing them carefully since I left Earth, saving them for moments that felt like they warranted a treat. This felt like a moment in the sense that I was very hungry and there was nothing else to eat. And the formal meal had not yet been served and showed no signs of being served soon, given the stiff silence that was running through the room like a bad electrical connection. I opened the first packet with the quiet efficiency of someone who has opened many packets in places where being quiet about it mattered. The crinkle of the wrapper was small. The smell was not small. Tim Tam smelled like chocolate and biscuit and warmth, and they smelled like that quite emphatically. Several heads turned. Elderly delegate beside me turned his wide-set eyes toward the packet with an expression I could not read. I took a biscuit and bit both ends off. Then I held it upright with one end in my coffee, which I had somehow obtained from the serving point near the door, because I had noticed it on the way in, and had the presence of mind to grab a cup. I held the Tim Tam with one end submerged and the other end to my lips, and sucked through it until the chocolate walls collapsed and the whole thing dissolved into a warm, sweet mouthful. The Tim Tam slam, technically a method, practically a spiritual experience. I became aware that the delegate beside me had not looked away. I looked back at him. He was watching the process with the focused attention of someone whose mind had just been entirely emptied of whatever it had been full of a moment ago. The negotiations, the 60 years, the 40 star systems, all of it had been temporarily replaced by the mystery of what he had just witnessed. I held out the packet to him. He looked at the packet. He looked at me. Nobody in the room was speaking. I was not entirely aware of this at the time. I picked up another biscuit, held it up, bit both ends off to demonstrate, and held it toward him. Then I nodded at the cup in front of him, which also had a warm drink in it, the Dacian equivalent of something hot and ceremonial. He looked at the biscuit. He looked at the cup. He looked at me one more time. Then he took the biscuit. He replicated what I had done with careful precision, the way you do something when you are not sure you understand it, but you are committed to trying. He bit both ends off. He placed one end in the cup. He waited a moment. Then he held the other end to where his mouth was and drew through it. The Tim Tam collapsed. He was very still for a moment. I thought about what Elaine had told me, the briefing room back in Cairns, about how the Dawashian Compact had a system of trust signaling built around the sharing of food, about how the formal offer and acceptance of a consumable in a shared space was their oldest and most binding gesture of non-aggression. She had mentioned it in the context of things I should know. She had not mentioned it in the context of things I would accidentally do in the middle of a diplomatic summit that had been in crisis for 3 days. I did not know any of that yet. I just knew he seemed to be enjoying the Tim Tam. I smiled at him. He made a sound I could not identify. Around the table, something had shifted. A quality of air that had been compressed, suddenly releasing like the drop in atmospheric pressure before rain. He said something in Dacian. The translation device for once hesitated before rendering his words. Then it said, very quietly in my ear, "This is offered without condition and without past." I thought about that for a second. It sounded like a kind thing to say. It sounded like something you said when you were trying to start something over. I Said she'll be right, mate. I said it. The way you say it in Queensland, which is the way you say everything there. Which is with the full and unqualified confidence that whatever has gone wrong will eventually sort itself out, because things generally do if you give them room to. There was a pause while the translation device processed this. What it produced in Dishan was apparently, the universe is resilient, we will endure. I learned this later. I was not aware of it in the moment. What I was aware of was that the elderly delegate looked at me for a long time with those wide-set eyes, and then his rigid posture changed, not dramatically, not in a way you could have pointed to precisely, but something in the architecture of his sitting came loose. In a good way, like a door that has been stuck finally swinging open on its hinge. He turned to the table. He said something to the room. The veal diplomat across from him, whom I recognized as one of the senior members of the ship's council, looked at me with an expression I had no framework for. Then he said something back. His posture changed too, in the same slow and significant way. Curator 9 appeared at my shoulder roughly 4 minutes after all of this began. I heard its footsteps in the corridor before it reached me, and knew by the speed that it had been informed of my location. It stood behind my chair and was very quiet for a moment, which told me it was trying to decide how alarmed to be. Then it said very softly, "Do not move, do not speak, do not do anything else." I was not planning to do anything else. I was eating a Tim Tam. I nodded once to show I had heard. What followed took about 2 hours and involved a great deal of formal veil and Dashan speech that I did not understand. Slow and deliberate negotiation that Curator 9 translated for me in fragments afterwards, and the gradual realization by every member of both delegations that something had shifted in the room that they had not been able to manufacture themselves in 60 years of trying. The elderly delegate's name was High Chancellor Dews. Curator 9 told me this after, in the corridor, with a careful tone it used when it was passing on information it found remarkable. He was the senior diplomatic voice of the compact and had been at every major negotiation for 4 decades. He had not accepted anything offered by a Vale-affiliated person 11 years, because 11 years ago a previous exchange had gone badly enough that the sharing gesture had been suspended as a sign of continued mistrust. He had accepted a biscuit from me because I was hungry, and the door was open and there was an empty chair. Curator 9 walked beside me back toward my quarters and did not speak for a long time. I was still eating, working through the last of the first packet with the patient satisfaction of someone who had been hungry for too long. After a while, Curator 9 said, "The translation of your phrase shall be right." The device rendered it as a statement about the endurance of the universe. "Yeah," I said, "I know. Is that what you intended?" I thought about it. I intended to tell him it would work out, I said, because it usually does. People generally want things to work out if you give them a chance to choose it. Curator 9 was quiet again. Then it said, "That is a very simple principle. Most useful things are," I said. We reached my quarters. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the second packet of Tim Tams. I had been saving those. I was still going to save them, but I took one out, sat back, and thought about what had just happened. 3 days later, after the delegation departed with a provisional Agreement signed for the first time in over a decade. Vosta came to my quarters and sat down with her recording device and looked at me for a moment. Before she spoke, she said, "The Dawashian delegation has formally requested that you be registered as an affiliated representative of the exchange program." I said I did not know what that meant. She said it meant they wanted me on the record as someone who had participated in and facilitated the negotiation. It was a formal acknowledgement, a title. I asked what the title was. She translated it from Dishoshan. The translation came back as one who walks without fear and shares bread. I thought about it. Do I get any actual bread? I asked. Vaseta looked at me with those amber eyes for a long moment, then she made the small sound that Curator 9 had once told me was the veil equivalent of a reluctant smile. "I will make an inquiry," she said. The inquiry did not result in bread, but the title was entered into the official record of the Galactic Academic Exchange Program, and I am told it is still there, listed alongside my name and the name of my home city and the date of the session, which was a Tuesday, which I thought was appropriate. The galaxy had changed, at least in some small way, on a Tuesday morning, the same as it always seemed to. I put the second packet of Tim Tams back in my bag and went to find Fenoru because the observation session was due, and I had learned that Fenoru got slightly out of sorts when the schedule changed. I did not want Fenoru to get out of sorts. It had started sharing its snack with me during the observation sessions, which was a thing I had not asked for and had not expected, and which I appreciated quite a lot. I knocked on the research bay door. Fenoru opened it, looked at me, and held out half of whatever it was eating. I took it. It tasted strange and faintly mineral, the way water from a new tap tastes different from home, but it was offered freely and accepted freely, and on a ship that was still processing what that meant. I thought that was exactly the right way to spend an afternoon. The alarm started at 3:22 in the morning ship time, which I know precisely because I had been awake for exactly 4 minutes, which was enough time to determine that the sound was not a drill. I had never heard the ship's emergency alarm before, but it had the unmistakable quality of a sound that expects you to move, not a beeping reminder, not a soft chime. This was a sustained low-frequency pulse that ran through the hull of the vessel and into the mattress beneath me, like something pressing a finger steadily against the ship's spine. The lights in my quarter shifted from Ristim to a pale, urgent blue. I sat up and reached for my shoes. From the corridor came sounds I had not heard before, quick overlapping movement, multiple voices in veil. The translation device was on the shelf, and I put it in my ear as I stood, and the fragments that came through were partial and dense. Lower sections: environmental systems containment failure, biological alert. I opened my door. The corridor was full of crew moving fast in one direction, away from the midsection of the ship. None of them were looking at me. They had the particular focused speed of people who knew exactly where they were not supposed to be and were committed to getting there quickly. 3 of them were already in sealed suits, thin and close-fitting, with face panels that caught the emergency lighting. I stepped into the corridor. A crew member moving past me stopped and said something rapid and sharp in veil. "Go back," the translation device said. Restricted. I asked what had happened. The crew member's 4 eyes tracked Rapidly between me and the corridor from which they had come, they said something else, and the device gave me a partial translation. Containment braid low. Environmental conduit, organism. Infiltration, what kind of organism? I asked. They gave me a look that was not quite fear and not quite urgency, but something that combined both into a single sustained intensity. Then they said a word in Veil that the translation device rendered as trillworm. I did not know what a trillworm was. The crew member left. I stood in the corridor for a moment. The alarm continued its low, steady pulse. More crew passed. I noticed that the direction of movement had a particular character, that nobody was moving toward the midsection, which I had come to understand was where the environmental conduits ran, the systems that managed the ship's air circulation, temperature regulation, and biological filtration. If something had infiltrated those systems, it meant the problem was throughout the ship, spread through its breathing infrastructure, which was not a small problem. I went to find Curator 9. Curator 9 was in the coordination room near the bridge section, a small space with multiple display surfaces showing the ship's internal monitoring feed. When I entered, it turned and looked at me with both sets of eyes in a way that communicated several things at once, none of which were entirely good. You should be in your quarters, it said. What is a trillworm? I said. Curator 9 turned back to the displays. On one of them, I could see a thermal map of the ship's lower section and moving through the conduit network visible as small heat signatures were perhaps 40 or 50 individual forms. They moved in clusters and then separated and then moved together again, a slow shifting pattern, like schools of something in shallow water. Trillworms are a parasitic organism. Curator 9 said they enter environmental systems through external hull microreactors, typically during the kind of deep space transit we completed 4 days ago. They feed on the mineral deposits in the conduit lining. Their primary defense mechanism is a secretion. What kind of secretion? Neuroinhibitory compound delivered as an aerosol when the organism feels threatened. Curator 9 looked at me for Veil biology. Contact with this compound produces an immediate and involuntary fear state. The neurological response is similar to an acute panic response, but it does not diminish with time or reassurance. It simply persists until the organism is removed from proximity. I looked at the thermal map. So every Veil crew member who goes near them will have a panic response they cannot control. Yes, and you cannot switch off the environmental system to starve them out. Switching off the environmental system would affect air quality for the entire ship within approximately 2 hours, and they will keep moving through the conduits. Yes, they move toward warmth. They will progressively infiltrate all sections. I looked at the map for a moment. The heat signatures were moving slowly but steadily. What do they look like? I said. Curator 9 called up an image on the display. The trillworm was approximately 40 cm long, segmented with a thick body and short legs in multiple pairs running down its sides. It was pale, almost translucent, and moved with the smooth, deliberate purpose of something that had been navigating confined spaces for its entire evolutionary history. It looked, to me, exactly like a large centipede. Not a small one, a proper one, the kind you find in old sheds in tropical climates, the kind that moves with a Confidence that communicates very clearly that it knows the terrain better than you do and is simply tolerating your presence. I had found one in my boot when I was 12 in Townsville. I had shaken my boot out over the garden and watched it land and move off into the grass with that same smooth, purposeful stride, and my mom had said something unprintable, and I had put the boot on and gone to school. I need a bucket and something long, I said. Curator 9 turned to look at me. Fully, I'm a bucket, I said, or a container, something with a lid and something I can use to move them with. I mop handle, a rod, anything long. Curator 9 was quiet for a moment. Then it said very carefully, you are proposing to enter the conduit system. Someone has to, I said, and the neuroinhibitory thing that works on veil biology. Yes, I am not veil, I said. Curator 9 looked at me. I looked at Curator 9. The alarm continued its pulse. In the background, I need to know one thing first, I said. Are they toxic to me? Not the fear thing, physically toxic. Curator 9 pulled up data on the display. It was quiet for several seconds, which was longer than usual. Then it said, the secretion compound is listed in our biological database as non-lethal to human biology. There are no recorded interactions. You would be the first human to encounter them. I nodded. That is probably fine, I said. There is a second compound, Curator 9 said, delivered on direct contact. Data on this one is incomplete. It is listed as survivable in small quantities. For most species, the sample size for humans is 0. I thought about the emergency ration packs. I will avoid direct contact, I said. Bucket and a long handle. Curator 9 was quiet for a very long time. Then it said, I will get you a bucket. The maintenance locker was 2 corridors away and contained, among other things, a heavy container with a sealed lid, a rigid cleaning tool with a long handle, and a set of protective gloves rated for chemical environments. Curator 9 provided all 3 and then did something I had not expected. It followed me to the access panel of the lower environmental conduit. I looked at it. You cannot come in, I said. The fear response, I am aware. Curator 9 said, I will monitor from outside and relay your location to the bridge. Fair enough, I said. I opened the panel. The conduit was about 1 m in diameter, lit from within by the same emergency blue as the rest of the ship, and warm in a way that was welcoming if you were a trill worm, and slightly close if you were a 20-year-old from Cairns. I got down on my hands and knees and went in. First one I found was about 6 m in, sitting in a curve of the conduit where it bent to follow the ship's inner hull. It was exactly as the picture had shown. Pale 40 cm, very still when it registered something larger sharing its space. I put the container down, opened the lid, and used the long handle to guide it in. It went without drama. They are not aggressive animals. They are foragers. They go where the food is, and they move away from things bigger than themselves when given the option. The option I gave them was the container, which was warm and enclosed and smelled, I assumed, like somewhere safe to be. I worked for 42 minutes. I know the time because Curator 9 was narrating my location and actions to the bridge monitoring system, and the recording was later played back to me in sections. Narration was precise and factual. Subject has entered secondary conduit junction. Subject is moving toward thermal cluster. Subject has captured 3 organisms, subject is singing. I had not been aware I was singing. It was a song from the radio, something I had listened to on the trip up in the shuttle, and I had apparently started humming it somewhere around the 20-minute mark without noticing. Curator 9's narration noted it twice. The second notation added, subject does not appear. Distressed, there were 47 trilorms in total. I got 44 of them into the container, sealed lid, and managed to maneuver the remaining 3 out of the conduit system and into a secondary containment bag that Curator 9 had ready at the access panel. When I reversed back out, I straightened up. I took my gloves off. My knees were sore from crawling, and my back had an opinion about the past 42 minutes that it was expressing in real time. I looked at the sealed container. Inside it, 44 large centipede-like organisms were redistributing themselves in the warm, enclosed space, and probably very pleased with how the evening had gone. Curator 9 was looking at me with both sets of eyes. I said, reckon I got most of them. Should have a look in about an hour to see if there are any strays. Curator 9 made a sound. The translation device rendered it as a kind of extended exhalation, which I had come to understand was the veil equivalent of releasing held tension. Behind it, the corridor was full of crew, every crew member who had retreated to the safe sections of the ship had apparently been watching the monitoring feed for the last 42 minutes. They were lined up along the corridor as far as I could see, very still, in the way that groups of people stand when they are not sure what to do with what they have just seen. I gave them a nod. Several of them slowly nodded back. I carried the container to the secondary airlock and asked Curator 9 to confirm the correct procedure for external release. The trill worms were then ejected into space. I did not think about this too hard. They would have compromised the ship's air systems if left aboard. Out there, they would find their way somewhere else eventually. That was the nature of things that moved through darkness looking for warmth. Vasetta was waiting outside the airlock room. She had been in her stress suppression pod when the alarm began, which is what the veil did in genuine crisis. They retreated to small enclosed spaces that filtered the air and blocked external stimuli until neurological response could be managed. She had come out of the pod once the trilorm alert was lifted, and she looked like someone who had been through an experience that had rearranged several things she had considered settled. She looked at me for a long moment, then she asked, "Were you afraid?" I considered the question honestly, the way she had come to expect me to consider things without performing an answer. "Not really," I said. "They are interesting animals, fast learners in an enclosed space, figured it out pretty quick." Vasetta made a note. "They are the source of one of the most acute fear responses in veil biology," she said. "We have a hard neurological reaction to them, evolved over thousands of years of cohabitation on our home world. It is not a choice or a cultural response. It is a biological one. Our brains produce it regardless of intent, right?" I said. "You had no such response." "They looked like centipedes," I said. "I grew up near centipedes." Vasetta looked at me. I looked back at her. "Jess Calloway," she said slowly, as if weighing each word before she released it. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" I thought about it. "Fixed the air system," I said. She made the sound, the reluctant smile sound. She made it quietly and turned away. before it finished, which I had come to understand meant she had not wanted to make it but had not been able to stop it. I went back to my quarters, my knees still locked. I sat on the edge of my bed and felt the ship settle around me as the emergency alarm went quiet for the first time in 42 minutes, and the lighting shifted from urgent blue back to the ordinary color of the ship. At rest, I had been intending to go straight to sleep. Instead, I sat there for a while and thought about what Visita had said about the fear response being biological, about her crew not being able to choose it or override it or reason through it, about how for them those animals in the conduit were not just alarming, they were physically unavoidable. I had not understood that fully until she said it. And what struck me, sitting on my bed with sore knees in the dark, was not that I had done something brave. I genuinely did not think it was brave. Bravery, as I understood it, involved feeling the fear and doing the thing. Anyway, I had not felt the fear. I had felt something closer to mild interest and a practical problem in a small space. But what moved me sitting there was the image of the crew in the corridor, 40 beings who had spent their careers in deep space, who understood this ship better than I understood my own face in the mirror, who were extraordinary in ways I was not even equipped to recognize, all standing at the edge of something they could not because they were not strong enough, not because they did not want to, just because of the wiring they had been born with. And then there was me with my sore knees and my centipede tolerance and my inability to register a threat until it was well and truly past, a byproduct of growing up somewhere that would kill you in 12 different ways before lunchtime. That was not heroism, that was geography, but it was also in some specific and important moment exactly what was needed. I laid down, I pulled the blanket up. At some point Fenoru knocked on the door and asked through it if I was available for the evening observation session. I said yes. Just a moment. I got up, opened the door, and Fenoru came in and sat up in the usual spot by the window. It had brought 2 snacks this time. It put one by my side. Without being asked, I ate it and looked at the stars. The next morning Visita showed me the first draft of the chapter she was adding to her research document. The chapter was titled, in translation, on the utility of not knowing what you should be afraid of. I read it through. It was about me in the sense that all of her work lately was about me, but it was also about something larger, about the relationship between a species and its environment, and about how a world that produces constant low-level challenge produces beings who can absorb extraordinary pressure as a simple feature of daily life. She said she would send me the final version when it was complete. I said I would read it. She said she did not expect me to understand all of it. I said that was fair. She said with the careful precision she brought to everything she was not sure she was ready to say, I find your presence aboard this ship to be consistently remarkable. I want you to know that. I said thank you. She said it was not a compliment in the veil sense, which would have implied superiority. It was a statement of observed fact, which in the veil sense was much more significant. I thought about that for a while. It was, I decided, the nicest thing anyone had said to me since I left Cairns on the morning of my 41st day aboard the Perpendicular. Thought Curator 9 told me the ship would be returning me to Earth in 5 days. It said this in the same precise, unhurried tone it used for all information, and then it added, the crew has requested permission to hold a formal farewell ceremony. It paused. The request was submitted to the High Council. It was approved. I asked who had submitted it. Curator 9 said all of them. I sat with that for a moment. The farewell ceremony was not for 3 more days, which gave me time to finish several outstanding sessions with Vacetta, complete the last of the biological sample cataloging work that Fenoru and I had been doing together, and eat through the rest of the provisions I had been stockpiling in my quarters, which included the last of the pale sea-tasting food that I had found a way to request, specifically 3 of the emergency rations, which I had decided I genuinely liked and which continued to cause Curator 9 visible concern each time I ate them, and one Tim Tam I had. The last Tim Tam on day 43, standing at my narrow window, watching the stars at their slightly wrong angle. I did it properly, both ends off. One end in a cup of something warm that was not coffee, but had after 6 weeks started to feel like a reasonable substitute. The whole thing collapsed into warmth and sweetness the way it always does, and I thought about the High Chancellor in the gathering hall and his careful, precise replication of the process, and I thought about how a biscuit from a supermarket in Queensland had ended up in an official diplomatic record covering 40 star systems. My mom still did not know where I really was. She had sent me 3 text messages over the course of the 6 weeks, which had been relayed through the program's communication system with a 2-hour delay. The first said she hoped the research trip was going well and not to forget to drink water. The second said my cousin had found a job and was everyone going to have to make a fuss about that. The third said there was a cyclone warning for the Cape and she hoped I was not near the coast. I was approximately 40 light years from the coast. I replied to each of them as if I were in the Coral Sea, which felt slightly dishonest, but was, I thought, the kind of dishonesty that kept everyone comfortable, which is a different kind from the harmful sort. Vacetta came to see me on day 43, the day before the ceremony, and placed her completed research document on the narrow shelf next to my empty bag. It was long, several hundred pages in the veil format, which compressed text differently from human writing and still came out very long. The title rendered in translation was Unintentional Apex Behavior in Homo sapiens australis, Case Study in Environmental Conditioning and Adaptive Threshold Responses in a Sample of 1. She had subtitled it Preliminary Findings, Further Samples Required. I read the abstract while she sat across from me with her recording device. Abstract described me as a naturally occurring destabilizing force whose presence established social hierarchies without apparent intent, formed emotional bonds at a rate that bypassed standard diplomatic infrastructure, demonstrated physical resilience characteristics that remained outside the current collective database of recorded biological limits, and showed zero measurable alignment between environmental threat level and internal stress response, suggesting either a highly sophisticated coping architecture or a fundamental structural difference in how human beings map danger onto experience. The final sentence of the abstract said the subject appeared throughout the study period to be having a good time. I looked up from the document. That is a bit much, I said. I'm just from Cairns. Veta made the small sound. She had stopped trying to suppress it some weeks ago. Cairns, she said carefully in English, which she had been learning in fragments and now deployed with great concentration, is, I think, a remarkable place. It is all right. I said you would like the reef. She said she had read a great deal about the reef in preparation for this study, and she believed she would like it very much. I told her she was welcome to come and have a look. She said the logistics of Vale travel to Earth were not yet formally established, which was an accurate and carefully diplomatic way of saying it was not going to happen soon. But she said it the way you say things that you have not given up on, which is different from the way you say things that are simply not possible. The ceremony was held the following morning. I wore my Wabies jersey because I had worn it at the diplomatic summit, and it had at that point entered the ship's cultural record as the garment I was wearing when the provisional agreement was signed, which meant that in some official sense it was now a historical article of clothing, which was not something I had anticipated for it when I bought it at a petrol station outside Townsville 4 years ago. I wore my thongs because it was a warm ship, and the ceremony was in the gathering hall, which had the same warm ceremonial lighting as before, and because I had spent 42 days being exactly who I was, and I did not see a reason to change that for the departure. The room was full. I had not expected it to be that full. Every crew member who was not on essential bridge duty was present, along with Curator 9 at the front, Vasita to one side with her recording device and a stillness that was different from her usual stillness, and Fenneru near the back with its note-taking device and what I had come to recognize as its form of excitement, which was a particular quality of alertness that made it stand slightly more upright. A senior council member gave a formal speech in Vale that Curator 9 translated for me in pieces. The speech described the exchange program and its goals, and then it described, without using my name and without any of the warmth that I would have expected in a human farewell speech, a series of events that I understood to be about me: the diplomatic session, the biological crisis in the conduits, the hierarchy disruption, the study that Veta had conducted. Each was described in formal, careful language that communicated respect through precision, the way a craftsman respects their work by describing it accurately. Then the council member said my name and looked at me. Curator 9 said quietly in my ear, "You are invited to speak." I stood up. The room was completely silent. I am not a person who prepares speeches. I had not prepared one. I stood there for a moment and thought about what the last 42 days had been and what I wanted to leave in the room, which felt like the right way to think about it. I said, "Look after yourselves, eh?" I said it the way you say it when you are leaving somewhere you are comfortable and you are going to miss it, but you know that the people you are leaving are going to be fine because you have seen what they are made of, and it is good material. Tone of it carries the thing you mean, even when the words are simple, and they words were as simple as I could make them. Curator 9 translated this into Vale. What it produced apparently was not a precise translation of those 4 words. What it produced was something that the Veal linguistic records later archived as I have seen. What you are and what you are will endure. Carry that with you. I found this out 2 days later when Curator 9 told me on the shuttle Back to the surface, I had not known in the room what was being said. I had only known that the room was very still after. I spoke in the way a room is still when something that was waiting to be said finally gets said, and that several people in the room had made small sounds, and that Fenelru in the back had stopped taking notes, and that Vasetta was looking at the wall slightly to my left, with the expression of someone deciding not to express something. I thanked them all and sat down. The ceremony continued for another hour with formal exchanges and presentations. I was given a small object, a smooth dark piece of material, shaped like nothing specific, which Curator 9 told me was the veil, equivalent of a letter of introduction. If I ever showed it to a veil in any part of the collective, it would communicate that I had been aboard a collective vessel, that I had been formally acknowledged by the High Council, and that I was in their framework a person of standing. I put it in my bag next to the empty Tim Tam wrappers and the Vegemite jar. The shuttle left the following morning. I did not look back at the ship as we descended. I looked forward at the blue line of the atmosphere getting closer, at the cloud layer, at the shapes of continents through the white. I looked at the coast of Queensland from the top of the sky, the specific green and golden blue of it, the way it curved against the Pacific like something that had grown there over a very long time and was not going anywhere. Debriefing at the facility near the coast was thorough and took most of a day. Elaine ran it with the same quick, focused energy she had had at the start, but there was something different in her. Now she kept looking at me with an expression I had not seen before, which was the expression of someone who had been given more information than they had expected and was still working out what it meant. The debrief form asked a series of questions. I answered them honestly. Greatest threat encountered: no Vegemite for 6 weeks. Greatest diplomatic achievement: Tim Tams brought 3 packets, used 2. Elaine read my answers. She looked at me over the top of the page. She said in the careful tone of someone choosing words very deliberately, the Veal Collective's High Council filed a formal communique to the exchange program office 4 days before your return. It contained a recommendation. I asked what kind of recommendation. She said they want more of you. I thought about that. More Australians. I said more humans from your region. She said their exact phrasing was further samples from the Cairn specimens population of origin, preferably in varied sub-regional representations. She paused. I believe that means they want people from different parts of Queensland, possibly broader. I asked how many. She said the initial request was for 6 with an option to expand the program based on outcomes. She told me there was a man from Broome already being assessed whose biosignals had apparently scored a 9 out of 10 for threshold tolerance. There were 2 sisters from Woolong who had both applied independently without knowing about each other, which the Veil had noted as an interesting data point. And there was a woman from Bunburg who had apparently been put forward by someone as a joke and had signed the consent form within 45 minutes of receiving it, which had moved her to the top of the assessment list. I said that sounded like someone's nan. Elaine said she was not at liberty to share the age of the applicants. I said fair enough. I signed the final forms. I handed back the equipment except for the translation device, which Elaine said I could keep. As a courtesy from the program, I shook her hand. I walked out of the facility into a late afternoon that smelled like grass and salt and the particular Queensland quality of warmth that means the day is finishing and was a good one. My mom picked me up outside. She had a bag of food in the back seat because she believed every long journey should end in food, which is the correct belief. She asked how the research trip was. I said it was good. She said I looked thin. I said the catering had been unusual. She said she had made a casserole and was I staying for dinner. I said yes. We drove home through the tail end of the afternoon and I watched the familiar things go past, the cane fields, the service stations, the low flat buildings with their signs in the sun, the hills going blue-green in the distance, and I felt the way you feel when something has changed in you, and you cannot point to the specific place it changed, but you know the weight of things is distributed differently now. That night I sat on the back porch and looked at the yard. The cassowary was down at the far end of the fence line, half in the scrub the way it always was. At this time of evening, it turned and looked at me with its small, precise eyes. I looked back at it. We had always understood each other, that bird and I. Not in any warm or sentimental way, in the way that two things can share a space and neither ask the other to be different from what it is. My phone buzzed, a message from the program coordinator, a name I did not recognize, asking if I would be willing to speak to the incoming cohort before their departure. Brief call, 30 minutes just to tell them what to expect. I thought about what I would tell them. I would tell them that the food was strange and there was no coffee, and the translation device took some getting used to. I would tell them about the hierarchy system and the eye contact rules and the importance of not greeting senior scholars with informal phrases. I would tell them that Fenoru was excellent company and that the research bay had very good samples to work with if marine biology was their area, or really any biology, because the Vale were generous with their data once they trusted you. I would tell them to bring Tim Tams too. Packets minimum 3 if they could manage it. I would not tell them they had nothing to be afraid of, because that was not something you could tell a person and have it mean anything. You either had the thing in you or you did not, and if you had grown up where we had grown up, near the reef and the scrub and the animals that did not care about your feelings, near the heat and the storms and the beautiful, dangerous world of it, then you probably had it in some form, not fearlessness, something quieter than that. The knowledge built from small moments over a long life, that the world was full of things that could hurt you and that you were going to walk through it anyway, and that the walking was actually fine, and that the things you found there were worth finding. I texted back, yeah, Rado. Put the phone in my pocket and looked at the yard. The cassowary had gone back into the scrub. The stars were coming out one at a time in the way they do when the sky is clearing after heat up there at a distance. I could not meaningfully imagine a ship shaped like living coral was continuing its path through the dark. Vasetta was in her research bay updating her notes. Fenoru was in its quarters with its snacks and its note-taking device. Curator 9 was checking systems with the careful precision of something that found order to be a form of care, and somewhere in the Dashan Compact's official records, in whatever archive held the proceedings of diplomatic sessions that had shifted the course of things between stars, there was an entry, a date, a name, a title in. Dash in that meant one who walks without fear and shares bread, below the entry. In the footnotes, a description of the gesture that had started it, a biscuit. Offered, a biscuit accepted, a phrase. Rendered across languages as something larger than itself. I did not know any of this for certain, but I thought it was probably there. 6 months later, a postcard arrived at my mom's address from a postal facility that did not have a recognizable origin city. The message was in careful, slightly formal English, written in a hand that pressed hard on the pen, the way you do when writing is not your native medium. It said, the reef data you sent us has been entered into the collective's biological archive. It is now the most complete record of your oceans' living systems in our database. Thank you for the samples. Also, thank you for the biscuit. The method was unexpected. It was, as you might say, brilliant. It was not signed with a name. In the bottom corner, in small and careful letters, it said V. I put it on the fridge. My mom asked who it was from. I said a colleague. She said I should invite them around sometime. I said I would see what I could do. Outside, the cassowary came out of the scrub and walked across the yard in the morning light, slow and deliberate and completely unbothered by the world, which was exactly the right way to be. The galaxy, meanwhile, had sent a request for more of us. It had no idea what it was in